Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams. Happy Tuesday to you. Welcome into DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Deemer Box. A lot for us to get into over the course of our discussion today. It's Jeff Sentell later on as part of a Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Really good stuff from Jeff Sentell, getting a chance to talk to five-star linebacker Noah Sewell. We'll talk to Jeff about his reaction to Sewell's official visit. I guess we'll talk to Jeff about his reaction to Sewell's reaction, having been on campus for the Notre Dame game this past Saturday. Of course, twists and turns continue with Georgia in its pursuit of a second running back for the 2020 class. That will come up with Jeff Sentell there as well. Pretty interesting stuff from Kendall Milton, too, when it comes to Jeff. We'll do all that coming up in just a little bit. Before we get to that, Jeremy Pruitt was asked, I think yesterday, possibly the most demeaning question imaginable about the current state of his program and its rivalry with Georgia. I'll give that to you off the top. And on today's show, I'm also going to share one example of how I think that Georgia's performance this season for the better, for the good, might have been flying under the radar at least just a little bit. I'll give you the numbers, let you decide for yourself. It's all on the way next as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Deemer Box, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Deemer Box. Go to deemerbox.com/DawgNation for $50 off while supplies last.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I tried to make the case yesterday here on our program for why, guys my age, people that remember the 90s, why we still feel that Georgia-Tennessee is a rivalry, even though the current state of the two programs could not appear to be, at least at first blush, to be going in opposite directions. Georgia is seemingly a program continually on the ascent as it builds towards what Dog fans hope turns out to be a national championship. Tennessee is circling the drain right now. I'm not even quite sure. They're even worse than most of us imagined. I don't think any of us thought they'd be all that good. So it's almost like you have to really dig up into the history books. You have to really reach into your imagination to kind of conjure this one up as a rivalry on Saturday because the overall appearances of the program are just quite so different. And as an example of just maybe how bad things are. And listen, Georgia's still got to go out and play a game on Saturday. It can't take anybody for granted. It can't take anybody lightly. Blah, blah, blah. You got to say all that kind of stuff. But as an example of just how bad things may have gotten for Tennessee in comparison to one of its big rivals in the SEC East, Georgia, I present to you Exhibit A. So Jeremy Pruitt, the Tennessee coach, is asked during the press conference yesterday about the fact that some Georgia fans, and we've talked about this, there's all kinds of social media campaigns out there, and I've showed you some of the graphics and everything else of if you take what Tennessee has done in the past when they've tried to checkerboard Neyland Stadium, every other section either wears the orange or the white, the orange or the white. Georgia fans have said, okay, well, let's take that same blueprint and let's substitute red in place of this and black in place of that. The assumption among many Georgia fans, there are going to be so many UGA fans there this upcoming Saturday that Georgia fans themselves can also coordinate and organize a checkerboard. Now, I've said before that I think that would be a pretty difficult pull, and if Georgia even has as many as 20,000 fans in Neyland Stadium on Saturday, that in itself is a pretty impressive performance, just given how few college football fans travel to away games the way they used to. It used to be a big thing to do. There's a lot less of that now. Case in point, the Notre Dame game at Athens a couple of weeks ago, as hyped as it was, there weren't much more than about 10,000 Notre Dame fans there. They got 8,000 tickets from Georgia. You'd be hard-pressed to see that many more than that actually made their way into Dooley Field and Sanford Stadium. The teams just don't travel that much. Georgia is a little bit of an outlier in that regard. But so much so they could checkerboard Neyland Stadium and make the entire thing look like a coordinated stadium takeover. Here's a very funny exchange with a reporter and a pretty terse response from Tennessee coach Jeremy Pruitt. I think you'll like this.
I was wondering if you have heard Georgia fans are trying to checker Neyland red and black, just your reaction to that.
I have a hard time believing that it would happen.
Something about Pruitt, just as deadpan as he is, I have a hard time believing that would happen. There's something about that I find to be just kind of quite perfect because, let's face it, as I said yesterday, if you want to go back and look at the time that I grew up, I'm talking about, coming of age as a high school kid, I remember being in Athens for the 92 game, a pretty good Georgia team, and a lot of turnovers there that day, and Tennessee came in and ended up sneaking out of Athens with a win. It was a heartbreaking game for a lot of us who were growing up and were fans there at that time, and not to mention the the Peyton Manning era that would follow after that. And, I remember the first game day game, the first time ESPN's College Game Day was in Athens in 1998. And Georgia fans had just come off a big win at LSU, feeling like they had a chance to go out and beat Tennessee there that day. And Tennessee, to its credit, dominated the game and would eventually go on that year to win the national championship. You'll give them credit for the performances, but for the Georgia fans who lived through that, that was a pretty rough time. So for people that have that perspective, for people that can remember that backstory, to think things have changed so much in all these subsequent years that now before the 2019 game, Jeremy Pruitt's being asked how badly he thinks that Georgia fans might take over Neyland Stadium. I think for a lot of Georgia fans, there is a pretty strong sense of satisfaction knowing that things have altered quite this much. Ultimately, will there be a checkerboard of Neyland Stadium? I think that's probably a pretty bold ask, even for Georgia fans. However, I do think there'll be a substantial number of folks dressed in red and black, and my guess is come this Saturday in Neyland Stadium, I think they're going to get to see another pretty good show to enjoy. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon, of course, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast wherever you find them. The Apple Podcast Player, the Google Podcast Player. We post the show even. The world-famous DawgNation.com as well. We're just really glad to have you with us. And today, DawgNation Daily, the entire thing is brought to you by our friends at DeemerBox. Now, if you've seen this on video, you know kind of what this is. This is kind of like the ultimate tailgating apparatus. It's a indestructible Pelican case. There's actually something in my DeemerBox right now. I'm not even sure what it is. Somebody put something in here, but nonetheless, this is it. And it's got a Bluetooth speaker on the front. This thing the Bluetooth speaker works like up to 100 feet away. It's got 40 hours of battery life. At our DawgNation Express tailgate the other day, we had kind of a cool experience where we hooked a bunch of these up together and all the Bluetooth speakers working together. It ends up making like this really amazing sound system, so you can kind of connect all that together. We had a guy in here, I told you the other day, we're kind of working and reconfiguring and kind of rebuilding, remodeling our studio. It's going to be bigger and better than ever before, our DawgNation World Headquarters studios. One of the guys that's been here working on this was also a big fan of DeemerBox. He thought it was really cool that we had some DeemerBoxes as well. He said one of the things he likes to do is because these things float, they're waterproof, they float. He said, you're Chattahoochee River, something like that on the weekend or the lake or whatever, you can just pop this DeemerBox right down there in the water. So it's pretty good stuff there with our friends at DeemerBox. And there's a great offer I want to tell you about right now. Right now, we're able to offer $50 off the first 100 orders. This is only while supplies last, but get $50 off your DeemerBox order. Whatever you're doing outdoors, DeemerBox is the perfect accompaniment to go along with that, especially when it comes to tailgating stuff. The website you want to go to is DeemerBox.com. Now, if you're listening, radio podcast, let me give you the spelling on this. It's D-E-M-E-R, DeemerBox.com, just one E in the front. D-E-M-E-R, DeemerBox.com/DawgNation. You can get $50 off this while supplies last, the great DeemerBox here, and it's great to have them as part of DawgNation Daily. All right, before we get Jeff SENTELL for our Marlowe's Tavern Insider update today, I want to talk about something else that was kind of on my mind, and I mentioned this briefly to our video audience yesterday. We do kind of a comment section in the show called our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, and I was saying that when I've been looking at some stats for Georgia, I think pretty quietly Georgia's actually been pretty good. It's something that sometimes can be a little misleading, but in Georgia's case, I'm not quite so sure that it is. Because let's face it, here's what a lot of us did going back to this past weekend. Georgia didn't play, but other national contenders did. Alabama played Ole Miss. Clemson played North Carolina. Ohio State played Nebraska. I don't remember who Oklahoma played, but you got a chance to kind of see a pretty good collection of the national elite on the field. And we're all kind of curious, 5 weeks into the season, 4 Georgia games into the season, or the regular season anyway, how does Georgia compare to the best teams in the country? Well, I believe there's one aspect of Georgia that actually compares pretty favorably to the national elite when you look at things a little deeper. Georgia right now is 6th in America in points allowed per game, yielding just 10 per game. We'll show you the teams that are ranked ahead of UGA right now. It's Wisconsin, it's Penn State, it's Iowa, it's Ohio State. So Big Ten teams occupy all 4 of the top 4 spots here. Then you get to Florida, and then you get to Georgia. But here's where I think things kind of get interesting for me just a little bit, and why I think that Georgia ranking 6th at 10 per game is actually pretty interesting. Take a look at who Wisconsin's played. They're the team that's yielded the fewest points per game thus far this season. They played South Florida, Central Michigan. They have played Michigan, although you can decide for yourself how impressive that opponent even is anymore. And they played Northwestern, a relatively low-scoring team. Penn State's played Idaho, Buffalo, Pitt, and then I thought pretty impressive this past Friday night against Maryland. Iowa's played Miami of Ohio, Rutgers, Iowa State, and Middle Tennessee State. Ohio State's played Florida Atlantic, Cincinnati, Indiana, also Miami of Ohio, and this past Saturday I thought pretty impressive, all things considered, against Nebraska, given that was a road spot. Florida has played Miami of Florida, UT Martin, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then this past week they played Towson, which I think did have Joe Flacco's brother quarterback, but it's still Towson. Now, Georgia, by comparison, in its 4 games, has played 2 Power 5 opponents. One of those is Vanderbilt. You may say, well, Vanderbilt, for the most part, is no great shakes, but Vanderbilt did score 24 on the road at Purdue, scored 38 in kind of a blowout game against LSU, but still hung 38 points on the LSU defense. Georgia held them to just 6 points that night to open the season. Arkansas State, which kind of gets lumped together with the kind of also ran Georgia opponents. Have you seen what Arkansas State has done offensively in the other games, which has not played Georgia this season? They scored 30 in week 1 against an undefeated SMU team. They scored 43 in a win at UNLV, have scored 41, and have scored 50 points. So when not playing Georgia, Arkansas State has been putting up at least 30 points in every game and 40 or more in 3 of its 4 games, and even including 50 this past week. Now, you also add to that, the one thing that makes Georgia's 10 points a game look pretty impressive is the fact that Georgia, in comparison to Florida, Ohio State, Iowa, Penn State, and Wisconsin, has also played a top 10 team up to this point. And defensively, even though there was a lot said about Georgia maybe not getting after the quarterback as much as you would have liked against Notre Dame, and maybe not getting as many tackles for loss as you would have liked against Notre Dame, maybe not getting as much of that, Georgia did a pretty good job of keeping the Fighting Irish off the scoreboard. In fact, the touchdown that Notre Dame scores comes on a very short field, and Notre Dame had to go on 4th down to even get that. And of course, as we talk about all of this, it'll also harken back to 2017 when Georgia was also quite good at keeping teams off the scoreboard. I mean, ultimately, I'm not really the kind of guy a lot of times who's necessarily going to push a stat like this, because when it comes to points allowed, points scored, things along those lines, that typically is a factor and a component of who you've played equally as much as how you've played. But in Georgia's case, when you look at its 4 games thus far this season, the offenses that it's gone up against, the fact that Georgia is only averaging 10 points per game against those teams, I think actually speaks pretty well for what Georgia's doing defensively. And, of course, all of this kind of comes to mind with Georgia going back to Knoxville on Saturday, a place the last time UGA played there. It had one of the big signature performances of the early Kirby Smart era, getting a 41-0 shutout against the Vols. Now, is it too much to ask that Georgia might be able to repeat that feat against Tennessee this week? Maybe so. That might be a little greedy among UGA fans. But Kirby Smart was asked when he spoke to reporters yesterday how the fact that Georgia did pitch the shutout the last time that it was in Neyland Stadium, the last time that it was in Knoxville, how that factors into any of the kind of emotions for this Saturday's game. And Smart gave a pretty interesting answer to that. Here's Kirby on the subject.
I think they were in such a different state and time at that time. You know, their program was in a different direction than it really is now. And I don't look at that game as any kind of indication of where we've gone. Jake played well in a tough environment, but we had a different football team. You know, we had a very experienced defensive football team, and we had some really good players on offense at the skill positions. So I think that game obviously it has nothing to do with this game. They're playing with a high motor and a chip on their shoulder, and they're playing extremely hard, and we know we're going to get their best shot, and our job is to make sure they get our best shot.
So Kirby says that this upcoming Saturday's game against Tennessee doesn't really have anything to do with what happened there in 2017, and that's probably to a certain extent true, but the one thing the 2 games might have in common is that when Georgia went to Knoxville, even though that was kind of a depleted Tennessee team too, let's face it, Tennessee's now been depleted for a number of years, it was a bit of a message on the part of the Dogs. They were able to go out there and dominate that game from the word go the way they did. It showed fans that this team was going to be for real and was about to maybe go on a little bit of a run, and it worked out to be exactly that same way. I think it was probably a little bit of a harbinger for the national media as well of make sure you start paying attention to Georgia. Well, that's the one thing that this game this Saturday might have in common too. I mean, let's face it, we've said before, this is going to be a weird October for UGA. The only 3 games the Dogs will play this entire month are Tennessee this Saturday, and then it's South Carolina, and then it's Kentucky. At face value, some of that doesn't quite seem as hallmark and as marquee and as bold print as what Georgia's already done against Notre Dame and what it will do in the month of November when it takes on teams like Florida and Auburn. But in the never-ending comparison game between Georgia and the other national elite, Georgia gets a chance for the next couple of weeks to do what teams like Ohio State and Alabama have already done, play a consecutive series of games against overmatched opponents. And it's a chance for Georgia now to flex its muscles here a little bit. It's a chance for Georgia to now say, take a look at some of the things that we're able to do in comparison to what some of these other playoff contenders are currently able to do. And we can obviously talk about what Georgia hasn't done yet, hasn't sacked the quarterback enough, hasn't produced enough tackles for loss. That's getting better compared to 2018, but you still probably want more of that. However, don't let the discussion about what Georgia hasn't done yet distract you from what Georgia is doing pretty well. They're keeping teams out of the end zone at the moment, and my guess is that continues this Saturday against Tennessee and for a couple of weeks to come there as well. Before I bring on Jeff Sentell, let me also remind you about a great thing going on with our friends at Kroger right now. You know, it's flu season coming up, and this is the kind of thing that when it comes up, you don't want to miss work. Well, Kroger's got you taken care of when it comes to that because you can get your flu vaccination right there at Kroger. Now, there's no appointment needed. And really good news, you can get this flu vaccination for a copayment as low as $0. So find out more about this by going to this website. It's Kroger.com/flu. Kroger.com/flu. All right, here's what's coming up later on today on DawgNation Daily presented by DeemerBach. I'm going to share audio with you of what Georgia coach Kirby Smart said yesterday when asked about getting a chance to go up against his former offensive coordinator, Jim Chaney. We'll talk about that, and we'll address a little bit about how the Chaney impact in Knoxville is probably not quite as significant as I thought it would be, and certainly Vols fans hoped it would be. We'll do all that coming up later on. For now, though, there is a lot to get to when it comes to UGA recruiting. Stuff on Noah Sewell, good piece from Jeff Sentell there. Look back at Kendall Milton, who's also weighed in heavily on some hot topics involving UGA recruiting. We'll cover it all. We're glad you're with us. It's DawgNation Daily presented by DeemerBach. Hope you enjoy Jeff Sentell.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, it's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. It's good to have Jeff Sentell back with us here again on DawgNation Daily to talk about a number of things that he's been writing for DawgNation.com as the aftermath kind of continues for what was a very busy recruiting weekend for Georgia against Notre Dame, and the fallout's going to kind of be felt on this for a little while to come. First of all, Jeff, welcome back. Thanks for being a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update, and hope you're doing well today.
Hey, man, hope everybody's great. Hope everybody thinks about those steamer boxes. And I see, Brandon, you're ready to go with another SEC East O this week.
Yeah, I really am. Looking forward to seeing the Dogs in Neyland Stadium against Tennessee. Got a little bit of feedback coming in there right now. We'll see if we can get that cleaned up. But, yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that and being there. And, Jeff, also looking forward to getting a little bit of a follow-up from you on a piece that we may need to try this again. I'm getting a pretty bad echo coming in. Why don't we get Jeff off the phone, and we'll see if we can get him back up there and get that cleaned away. Sorry, y'all, that we've had problems with the phone here a little bit. We'll get that cleaned up and see if we can get that squared away. It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. I know many of you want to be able to hear from Jeff Sentell on that today. So while we get that squared away, let us take some of your comments. We appreciate your patience as always. Told you there might be a little bit of growing pain here and there as we build up and grow up and make DawgNation World Headquarters Studios even bigger and better than it's been before. We'll look forward to doing some more of that. And while we're working to get this fixed, let's get ready to get Jeff Sentell here. Wyatt Fielden says, morning, Jeff, and we'll get Jeff in a moment. Travis McCullough says it sounds like Noah Sewell really enjoyed himself the Notre Dame game. Yeah, that was my takeaway from that as well. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing more from Jeff on that. Bobby Bryan, always great to have you in our comment section. We really appreciate that. Brian Wilkerson says the only loss I see Georgia getting the regular season when we play Auburn at Auburn. That's obviously Georgia's toughest game. Now, you can debate for yourself if you think that's a potential loss for UGA. But it's obviously Georgia's toughest game on paper and probably made tougher by how Auburn's performed. We knew Auburn would be good defensively. That's turned out to be true. We knew they were going to be growing into themselves from an offensive standpoint. That's also seemingly turning out to be true. I thought that Bo Nix looked more mature against Mississippi State on Saturday, but he was also playing at home. Of course, for Auburn's sake, they get Georgia at home. So I think it'll be interesting to see what Auburn looks like offensively when they host Georgia in November. My guess is it'll be a better version of the offense than we probably saw in some of the month of September. But one way or another, we know that defense is going to remain formidable on that. Brian Mullis says the Florida and Auburn games, they're going to have to turn Jake loose and let him do more passing. Yeah, I think especially the Auburn game in particular, because Auburn's so good with its defensive line. I think that's the kind of game where you are going to have the extra dimension in your offense. You could say the same thing a little bit about Florida because, the one thing that Florida probably has as a strength compared to anything else is probably its front seven. So you probably do need to see a little bit more of Fromm on some of that kind of stuff. Sounds like we got the situation with Jeff SENTELL squared away and taken care of. So, Jeff, let me, I guess, just dive into this straight with you. Well, first of all, I guess let me say hello and thanks for being with us. And like I said before, I hope you're doing well.
Hey, Brandon, man, hope you're doing well too, sir. I hope the ghosts in the machine and the blind squirrels chewing on our wires have it a little bit better now in your new home.
Yeah, so we've had all kinds of phone issues as of late, so hopefully that's better. I still feel like I hear myself just a little bit, but I guess we'll have to just soldier on and see. Yeah, I'm just hearing the same thing over and over again. All right, we're gonna have to. I don't know what's going on. I'm just hearing the same thing that Jeff just said a moment ago. So, that's pretty rough. But we're gonna figure this out and get this taken care of, and we will be ready to provide you Jeff SENTELL, hopefully here. Ryan Patrick Presley, while we're waiting on Facebook, says Auburn couldn't beat Alabama. I hate to say it, but they are the fly in the he says Auburn could beat Alabama. They're the fly in the ointment. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. We have talked so much, and Auburn has talked so much about wanting to get away from the thing where it has road games every other year at Georgia and Alabama, but the byproduct of that is every other year you get a chance to host both those teams as well. And I actually think that's a pretty, significant ally in your championship pursuit because let's face it, if you're a team like Auburn, it's going to be hard to compete more than half the time anyway because that's for most teams about what it works out to be. So every other year for the last few years, Auburn's got the situation it enjoys right now. In 2017, they really used it to their advantage. They won the SEC West and, were competitive for a while with Georgia in the SEC championship game. Here in 2019, to have that month of November where you host both of those teams, Georgia and Alabama, in your own stadium, I think that helps Auburn as much as it hurts it. And, I think it'll be very interesting to see Auburn against Florida on Saturday. I am very curious about that game. I've been very clear with y'all that I don't think that Florida is nearly as good as maybe some of the people during the offseason thought they might be. This is one of those games where I expected Florida to get its reckoning, and I still think that's probably, for the most part, going to be true. And then if Auburn does get past Florida on Saturday, then my goodness, where does it go from there for them? We did I'm going to talk more about this in a moment in terms of how you compare Auburn to the top teams in the country right now. The Tigers are just, I think you have to put them up there, given the fact they've got a neutral site win against Oregon, given the fact that, they beat up on Mississippi State really bad on Saturday. They went to Texas A&M and won, and say what you will, it's still a road game in conference in which they dominated. That's a pretty bold statement all the way around. So, pretty impressive there thus far from the Auburn Tigers. I think you got to give them credit for that. Joel Moody, let me get him on Facebook. He says, B.A., do you think that Georgia starts to open up the offense as we get to the College Football Playoff Committee making their weekly polls? We all know that where we land could be critical to our success. So, Joel, I think that's really pretty interesting. Now, I've said before that I think the race for the number 1 seed is going to be critical for Georgia, but for the most part, I don't think style points is required for Georgia quite as much as it's required for some of the other teams. Georgia's going to build its resume based on who it beats, not so much how it beats them, but for some of these games, Auburn included, you may need that extra mention of your offense just to win that game. All right, let's try Jeff SENTELL again. Jeff, let me try this. Are you with me, and how are things going? Can you hear me okay?
Brandon, how are you, sir?
Well, you sound good to me.
We're not talking in the echo chamber anymore.
Yeah, you sound good to me. Do I sound okay to you?
Well, besides the normal paranoia about not getting that 5-star, Auburn worries, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it's pretty good, man.
Yeah, that's pretty well said. Let me just kind of get into the piece he wrote with Noah Sewell over there at DawgNation.com. I thought it was good. I thought that your statement last Wednesday when you were with us before the hedges presented by Kroger, I thought that was pretty strong. It certainly seems like Sewell enjoyed himself at UGA and feels confident about the Dogs right now. I guess, would you mind giving us a couple of your key takeaways from having had a chance to talk to Sewell both before he took his Georgia visit and then again after the visit was over? What were your takeaways from that?
Well, I guess, Brandon, for you, as you like to see us side through quotes, you love it when a player uses the word love a lot, welcomed, fun, smiling. And here's what Georgia's done with Noah Sewell. And we tried to capture that with our perspective on the piece, was he had a fundamentally strong anchor official visit back in the summer. That was 3 days where he went A to Z on Georgia. That was basically everything that a plugged-in family that knows the recruiting game needs to look for: weight rooms, academic counselors, nutritionists, weight rooms, dorms, campus tours, degree fits, yada, yada, yada. And then he went into the Georgia official visit with basically two wishes. The first one was to see something spectacular in terms of the game day atmosphere. The green emoji check can go next to that one. And the second one was to still feel a brotherhood, a kinship, a bond developing with his potential future teammates in the linebacker room. And I think that one was not only, I'm not going to give it a green emoji check, I'm going to give it a blue and pink emoji check, because that's the color of the paintballs that Georgia did a very savvy move that somehow made the second day of Noah Sewell's official visit even more impactful than the game day visit with all those red lights.
Yeah, and that, the whole paintball thing, kind of goes back into what we've said before, that, Sewell's coming from Utah, and, different people are going to be attracted to different things. Some guys are going to want the hunting and fishing experience. Some guys are maybe going to want to see, what downtown Athens looks like. Different people are going to be attracted to different things. But for Sewell, I've always felt like relationships are going to be more important than anything else. Now, he does give you a pretty bold comment about the fans and kind of what the stadium atmosphere was like, but I've always felt like relationships were more important for the Sewell recruitment than virtually anything else. It's a long way to come. His family has a history of kind of, being college football out there on the West Coast. This is a little bit of a trailblazing recruitment for Georgia in a lot of ways, and those relationships were just going to have to be locked down, and it certainly sounds like Georgia's done a pretty good job of doing that, whether it be the coaching relationship, guys like Glenn Schumann, Dan Lanning, other linebackers in the linebacking room. That certainly seems to be progressing here pretty well, which for me was maybe more important for Sewell because of the geography more so than anything else. I know you've said that the geography ultimately wouldn't matter for Sewell's recruitment, but Jeff, my response to that is, well, that must mean that Georgia's doing a pretty good job of establishing the relationships, because if it wasn't for that, then I do think the geography probably would be a little bit of a thing to navigate.
Yeah, I think with a lot of those things with Noah, like the last time we spoke to him, which was before the official, we kind of teed up things there. He said phrases that still stick out to me, where he says there's something about Georgia that he can't explain. It feels like they're coaching a different game in Athens, a different type of ball. He's told me in the past that he really appreciates how Georgia keeps in touch with its former players, guys like the Sonny Michels, the Nick Chubbs, but specifically to his unit, the linebacker group with Roquan Smith. He's already seen how Georgia can win big games and get to the big games and put a linebacker in the first round, an inside linebacker in the first round, and win a Butkus Award in the SEC coming out of Georgia. And he's seen all those things accomplished by Glenn Schumann, who also coached Roquan. So with all that, this visit was important. And I think what we tried to get at, too, with Noah is what we try to do with a lot of these stories is, yes, we present a lot of material and we present a lot of thoughts about these young men. And we also try to identify what they are beyond the game as well. And I thought in the fourth quarter of that story, I kind of tucked some information back in there that I thought should give folks a minute to give themselves some pause. The first one, and I'm just going to say it, Brandon, it might be one of the best answers I've ever heard to Noah Sewell when he gave us what he thought was his best thing about playing football, his favorite thing about playing football. And I wanted to ask that question, Brandon, because the kid's 266. He can butt heads. He runs the football. I think he's at 9 yards per carry. He came back from an injury rehab and just jumped right in playing linebacker. He runs like a receiver. He has ball skills like a running back, and he hits like a defensive tackle. And he told me, with all that, his favorite thing to do on a football field is to watch the second string come in, because he likes to see others have success, and he feels that those guys on his football team work just as hard as the first team guys, but don't get half of the credit. And I thought that was an amazing answer. And another answer that I hope you put your microphone and hope you put your looking glass firmly upon is when I asked him about maybe the parting message that Kirby Smart left him with. And he said what Kirby said to him meant something, and it made an impact. I think his phrasing was, it surely did, or it really did. That's a lot of good things that Georgia's lining up here. And I know, Brandon, you're a big fan of golf, the links and golf metaphors.
Sure.
So I'm going to say this. With Georgia in its two visits for Noah Sewell, I think it stacked up a 60, 65, 66. And if somebody's going to go low enough to beat that, then you have to tip their cap to it.
It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with Jeff SENTELL here. Great way to describe just how things went for Sewell in Athens before. And, of course, we certainly appreciate Marlowe's Tavern being a part of this. And my suggestion to you would be is, if you're looking for a date night this time of year, boy, Marlowe's Tavern is a great, great choice for that. You can kind of slide in, sit together in a comfy booth, and maybe connect with that special significant other in your life across from some creme brulee. That's always a good choice on date night. I'm a big believer that when you do date night, you got to get dessert. I'm a big believer in that. And, of course, Marlowe's Tavern got some great, great dessert options. You can check that out at the Marlowe's nearest you. And don't forget, we do the Marlowe's matchup every Thursday with our buddy, former UGA great John Stinchcomb. And we got more Marlowe's broadcasts coming up live here on Thursday nights in the very near future as well. So I hope you'll stay tuned for a lot more of that. Jeff, I also enjoyed your piece with a five-star running back, Kendall Milton, recently. And seeing Milton in Athens for the Notre Dame game and seeing his entire family there and kind of their social media posts about that, you can't help but wonder the fact that Milton is highly rated as a player as he is, the seeming rock-solid nature of his commitment. How much does that help Georgia with other uncommitted players, knowing that you've got such a high-profile guy as committed to Georgia as he is? Milton's personality's got a little bit of magnetism to it. How much is Milton, helping Georgia right now in comparison to some of the other coattails that we've seen other recruits have in the past, Pied Piper types? Milton seemingly has that really big personality. Is it helping Georgia as much as it seems like it might be?
Yeah, Brendan, I don't know if with Kendall, he's so smooth. I don't know if Pied Piper actually works best. I think we need to modernize it and maybe have like the great Satchmo piping out some New Orleans jazz. I think that, a great trumpet player, because, I think you kind of nailed it right there, Brandon, when you said he has a magnetism to him. He has a confidence about him, and what he says carries weight. And this is a guy that wants to own a chain of car dealerships, hopefully around the Southeast once his playing days are done. Kendall has that way with him, and when he comes out so strongly for Georgia without seeming like he's coming strong for Georgia at all, I mean, the young man has already created a GIF across the internet with his flag waving out of the Georgia Jeep. Hat tip to the DawgNation.com production team for creating a viral GIF across the Twitter stratospheres and the like. But I think the main thing he said was he starts talking about the tight ends and what he said to them and about becoming the most dangerous offense in college football. I'm sure that was something right there, Brandon, that really struck a nerve with you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the kind of thing you hope to see Georgia be able to build. I mean, there's obviously – you just see what offensive football does on a Saturday when some teams are scoring big points and, you can debate the level of competition they're doing it against, but that definitely turns heads. And, the recruiting machine that Georgia has built, I think the next phase of that is going out there and really flexing yourself on a Saturday in, Saturday out basis when it comes to the offensive stuff. So I'm not surprised to hear Milton talking that way. I'm not surprised to hear him expressing the enthusiasm about that topic that he does. And I think he could certainly be right about that. And I think hopefully we would all agree that is the next phase for Georgia, to go out there and add a little extra pizzazz to what's already a very good offense.
Brandon, let me get into some football stuff with you here, because I know you like to see stuff up like that too. Do you think the way Georgia's built with that pizzazz on offense, that they'll only show that when it's necessary? Because as stout as Georgia keeps stacking up the defense and the players on defense like Legos, I think there's always going to be a little bit of that penchant to protect the defense. Even Nick Saban got into the act this weekend about he doesn't want to see his defense facing 80-plus snaps every weekend, because he knows sooner or later they'll get schemed out of something and somebody will bust one. What's your take on that?
There's a phrase that sometimes you use with your friends when you're busting chops or something. You say, you can't hide that money. You see somebody wearing nice clothes, nice car, something along those lines. You say you can't hide that money. I hope that Georgia one day builds an offense, or maybe it's got one right now that it's working on. I hope that Georgia builds an offense that's so explosive and so dynamic that it can't be kept under wraps. This idea that Georgia doesn't need more offense than this against whatever opponent that might be playing. I hope that one day Georgia builds an offense that's so explosive that it can't be hidden. It can't be held under wraps even by a conservative game plan, that it's so dynamic that dynamism becomes on display against virtually every opponent that it goes up against. I think the potential's there for that now. By the time 2020 rolls around, or Kendall Milton's career takes place, maybe that's happening each and every Saturday. But I think that's the next phase for Georgia, for it not to choose, is this a day we want to be dynamic offensively or not? It becomes the kind of thing where Georgia can't help but be explosive because that is who it is in its offensive DNA.
Yeah, it looks like they keep stacking up the pieces, and I think the wide receiver group, I think, is the key to that. Once the wide receivers are, and let's face it, Dominic Blaylock and George Pickens aren't where they're going to be in November yet. They've got to start making the move right now during this kind of early rungs of the SEC East. I guess I'll call it a gauntlet. The early rungs of the schedule. This is where these guys need to start developing. I think, and I would imagine most of the people that are listening in on the program would probably agree that Pickens, Blaylock, Cager, Simmons, Robertson, that's probably the group at receiver that Georgia needs to roll with for the rest of the season.
I think you're right about that.
I think that's the key to Georgia unlocking a lot of things. You saw a different DeAndre Swift. I don't know if people are speaking enough and giving enough lip service, but I was kind of nodding my head with all of Kirby Smart's post-game comments about, why didn't Zamir White get enough run? Why didn't they do more of this and do more of that? DeAndre Swift is such a special football player. When he's all the way in and fully healthy, and running the way he did between the tackles at Georgia, that's something dynamic. And as a play caller, Brandon, I would be tempted. I would imagine most of those to be tempted, because I think a lot of the frustration about tight end run and everything else, it still boils down to this. Whose hands on the Georgia offense do you want to put that rock? And you better give me a really good, strong conviction for somebody else getting that rock the majority of the snaps against a stout opponent other than DeAndre Swift. That's just the way I see it.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Speaking of running backs, I think pretty much for the next however long you come on our Marlowe Savin Insider Update, I'm going to keep asking you about this second running back for the class of 2020. You've written about this recently in the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. First of all, letting us know that Zachary Evans has returned to action for his North Shore High School there in Houston. Seemed to put up pretty good numbers in his most recent game. Obviously, there's still the curiosity that lingers going back to Tank Bigsby being in town for the Auburn game. Being in town for the Notre Dame game. Where do you think things kind of stand right now for Georgia in this 2020 running back situation? Whether it be with Bigsby, whether it be whatever's going on with Evans right now. I guess just kind of what is the latest. You can take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, that's kind of wherever it wants to go is probably the way this recruiting for the second running back can go. Brendan, I just feel that this one is going to be one to really anybody, at least publicly, to get their arms around with Zach Evans, and I think that's the way I'm going to approach this topic. Zachary Evans has been up and he has been down, and he has zigged and zagged in terms of the eventuality of whether he's going to end up at Georgia. Was he trending to Georgia? Is he still going to be at Georgia? I think these are unknown chapters that still need to be written. I think whatever adversity Zach Evans has gone through right now, this is what I'm going to keep stating. I think the road is still not paved yet, and that road needs to get paved before he can kind of finally see where he ends up. And I have no problems making this statement. Anybody that wants to tout out that they know exactly what's going on with Zachary Evans and they know what happens next week and the week after that, I think they're probably just trying to go out on a limb and nail a prediction, because the honest truth, Brandon, is I don't think anybody really knows what's going on with Zachary Evans in this recruitment. Where he felt last week, where he feels this week, where he feels next week, I don't think those are all going to be all congruent, lining up to where he feels on that middle Wednesday. I think it's December the 19th, and December the first day of the early signing period. I just think there's a lot of road ahead left with Zachary Evans, and I think, to me, and I'll just kind of give you a glimmer of what I'm thinking. I think there are names at the running back position that are much more likely to show up in Georgia's class than Zachary Evans right now. And the other thing that I shared on the forum is I think that E.J. Smith visit says a lot. Because Kendall Milton told me that he spent a lot of time talking to E.J. Smith, that's the son of the former NFL Hall of Famer and Florida great, about the opportunities that would be there at Georgia for any running back that wants to come in. Now, is E.J. Smith kind of the perfect fit for what Georgia's looking for? I don't think that's an exact fit. But I don't see Georgia going too far down the board to reach for the second running back in that class. I think possibilities like graduate transfers at running back, but also a third running back, a running back option. Like if you look at a guy like Corey Wren, well, he can give you at Georgia a lot of the plays that James Cook does right now as one of the 5 running backs in the room for Georgia. Of course, Georgia always wants to have 5 running backs in the stable, but I think a Corey Wren can run some of those plays, who's already in the class, and I also think an Arian Smith, which is now shaping up to be a Georgia-Clemson slobber knocker to the end in terms of who gets that commitment. I think he's the type of guy that could also run some of that James Cook stuff in the backfield. Because when we look at Georgia's running back position right now in its future, you got to likely move Swift and Arian away. We've talked about that ad nauseum. And for next year, right now, it will leave Milton, McIntosh, Zamir, and Cook. I think that's a pretty good group, especially when you might add a Corey Wren for some of that James Cook stuff that he's doing right now.
Yeah, I want to talk to you more about Wren and Smith, the two 2020 wide receivers, the one committed, one obviously still a pretty contested battle, because I did see your piece, the forum, about that. Let me squeeze in one thing, though, before we get there. You know what the twist and turns of the audience has been here when it's come with the running backs. Bigsby, because he's from Georgia, is incredibly popular. There are a lot of Georgia fans, even with Zachary Evans kind of out there and potentially available. If I came on the air today and announced that Georgia had gotten Bigsby, the response in the comment section would mostly be positive. I mean, I'm overwhelmingly positive, and the same thing would be true with Twitter and everything else. For the most part, the loud applause for Georgia getting Bigsby would drown out any questions of, well, what happened to Zachary Evans or anything like that. Bigsby's kind of a popular figure among UGA fans because they like in-state running backs. However, the one thing I have heard a little bit lately is from some people who've either reached out on Twitter or the comment section or whatever else is that Bigsby's too similar to Kendall Milton. They're both kind of the big power bruising running backs. They're, not to say they're not athletic, because obviously you can see on both their films they are, but Evans, because of the speed, is the different kind of dimension where Bigsby seems to replicate a little bit of what Kendall Milton does really well. What would you say about that, given the fact that Georgia's got the commitment from a very strong, big, kind of a bruising running back? Does Georgia need to use that second running back on a speedier type player? Now, I realize the Evans thing is complicated beyond more than just the evaluation of him as a football player, but he is the archetype of a faster running back. Does Georgia need to make sure its second running back for this class is a faster player?
Yeah, that's a good thought. I think Thunder and Lightning are still what needs to be kind of the common denominators for looking at Georgia's running backs when they bring them in twos. I don't think Kendall Milton and Tate Bigsby are like running backs in terms of skill sets, explosive ability, and power. I think Tate Bigsby kind of blurs the line a little bit because he's put on about 5.
We may have lost Jeff. I do want to get his answer to finish up here. I know we've kind of gone long with him, but let me see if we can get him back on the phone real quickly there. We just kind of cut out with him on that phone. Quality to me sounded way better after we kind of tinkered with our wires a little bit. So I do want to finish with Jeff. I know I've kept him long, so we'll see if we can get him back on the phone, and we'll see if we can stitch all of this together here. And I hope you're enjoying our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box here today. Obviously, we'll have a lot more of your comments coming up. Want to let you hear a little bit of Kirby talking about Jim Chaney and what it's like to have these two guys back together. For the most part, this is coach speak, I believe. A lot of times when coaches say one thing, sometimes I'm left to kind of think something different might actually be true. But when Kirby says it's probably not as big a deal as some of us assume, Georgia going up against an offensive coordinator that was in intimate situations with Georgia in closed-door meetings, I think that's probably the case, probably more so than not, but we'll do more of that coming up in just a moment. Looks like we got Jeff back on the phone. So, Jeff, let me pick up where we left off. We were hearing you kind of discuss some of the similarities and differences between Bigsby and Milton and kind of how all that goes. Obviously, you don't know quite when you dropped out, but we'll let you just kind of follow up on your answer on that.
Yeah, so I would say Milton is the clear Thunder. He's 220 right now. He'll probably be a 220, 225 back. The likeness there is Nick Chubb. The other back, I don't think Bigsby's the power back or a similar skill set to Milton. I think he's more the explosive, versatile, all-around guy. One thing I did learn is like the differences between his pro shuttle drill. Evans has the elite upon elite 3.83, and I think Kendall's was a 4.33. Well, Kendall had never really ran that. Tank Bigsby has never ran that discipline before, and he wasn't really trained up for that. That's a good reason why his 4.33 is a little bit higher. Tank's always been the guy, Brandon. If everybody remembers his recruitment, I think Clemson had him pegged as a ball-hawking safety. Others, when he was originally coming up out of Callaway High School, people thought he was an athlete because he could catch the ball. He could do so many things with the ball in his hands. I think he's more of that lightning, that all-purpose type guy look that would be the complement for Georgia. And, I would be remiss if I didn't include the name Don Chaney Jr. in here as well, because that's a guy who is spot on what would bring a lot of those things for the Sony Michel, the James Cook type player in the Georgia offense. And you're looking at a Miami flip with Chaney. You're looking at an Auburn flip with Tank. I think some of the structure around the Auburn commitment seems pretty sound now for Tank, considering the hot and cold that's been with Georgia, partly maybe likely because of the interest in Zachary Evans and trying to find the best available back. But I think when Tank looks at Auburn now, he sees a lot of stability. He sees a strong passer that will be there for 2 or 3 years at least with him. He sees a program that's arching into the top 10 and playing like a top 5, top 6 team. So I think a lot of the nuts and bolts right now for Auburn is looking pretty strong. So where Georgia goes in that running back, I liken it to musical chairs at times because it seems everything's dancing to the beat of its own independent drummer a lot. I think that's when we're just going to have to wait. Does Zachary Evans become a guy that Georgia still wants to include in that class? Can Georgia flip a Don Chaney? Can Georgia flip a Tank Bigsby? You don't hear a lot anymore on the trail about Marshawn Lloyd. And there's a guy like Ashad Clayton Johnson. That's the teammate of Cedric Von Prawn in New Orleans. Does he become somebody Georgia goes down its board a little bit to take in order to just take 2 running backs in this class? There's the published reports out there where Mr. Clayton is down to Kansas, or not down to, but he has Kansas and Georgia in a very odd-looking type 2, especially in the year 2019.
Yeah, that's quite a comparison. All right, I've kept you long. Let me squeeze in one tiny question before we go. I did enjoy your post at the forum.dawgnation.com, talking about the one receiver that Georgia does have, Corey Wren, although I guess he plays more of a running back for his high school team because they don't throw it very much, and then Arian Smith, who's contested battle Clemson has offered recently. Alabama, I guess, is in the mix on Arian a bit too. Arian is, to my knowledge, a little bit like Wren in that they are both kind of these world-class speedster types, true speedy receivers. And when you look at what Georgia has right now in its receiving core and what's really working, the size of George Pickens, the kind of overall total package for the most part of Dominic Blaylock, although Blaylock's not a pure speedster necessarily. Cager's kind of one of those seemingly a little bit bigger receivers. Obviously, he's on his way out the door at the end of this year. The point I'm getting to, though, is that Georgia seems to have the size, the big receivers down, guys that can go high point the football and create some separation and space for themselves. How much of a need in your mind is this true speedster receiver? I hate to make the comparison game, but to be Georgia's version of Jalen Waddle, a guy that occupies space in the middle because you're worried about big guys on the perimeter. How much does Georgia need just a burner to go along with the bigger guys that it has?
Yeah, that's the game there, Brandon. I know that's the end game. What a lot of people are thinking. One of my thoughts that I express a lot on the forum is I think Georgia's dime package now is as strong as it's ever been in the Kirby Smart era, especially if Eric Stokes and Tyson Campbell are back to 90, 95, 100%. And the reason for that is Georgia needs to mimic some of those scary offenses. Georgia doesn't have a guy who can put his foot in the ground and erase any type of coverage anybody wants to put their way on a 9 route. Remember those big plays that Nicole Hardman made against Alabama in the national championship game? That's just what you need against one of those elite defenses or one of those teams where you can just put that fear factor in the defense. And That's the one thing that Georgia doesn't have right now in the offense. And you hear a lot of fans and even national observers wonder what Georgia would look like if Mecole Hardman was still a senior on this football team. And that's the thing that Georgia is doing. You got to give their recruiting efforts a lot of credit, because Kirby Smart talks about self-scouting a lot. Well, what he really does on the recruiting trail is self-identify areas that which this team doesn't have. And besides a 210-pound, 6'2" corner that can run a 4.3, or a 266-pound inside linebacker that can run a 4.1 short shuttle, or besides 6'7" and 6'8" tight ends that run like the wind, I think the thing that they need is they need that explosive guy with a gear that very few football teams have. That's why Corey Wren is so appealing, and that's why a guy like, Arian Smith is still a guy that he can really run. He's fast among the fast guys, and that's somebody, you named it, Brandon. Alabama has two or three guys like that, it seems like, and Georgia needs to get back to having one or two of its own.
Boy, Jeff, it's great to be back talking recruiting with you again. Thanks so much for being a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. As we say goodbye to you, I'll remind folks that this is a great time to get out there and enjoy that Marlowe's patio, date night, business lunch, whatever else you may have going on. Marlowe's Tavern, a great way to impress the person sitting across the table from you, and I know you'll enjoy checking that out, and I hope you'll check us out as well this Thursday. Myself, the former UGA great John Stinchcomb, for our Marlowe's matchup, looking ahead to the Dogs' trip to Knoxville to take on the Tennessee Vols. Jeff, thanks for being with us. We'll look forward to reading you. Forum.DawgNation.com, DawgNation.com. Bunch of great stuff coming throughout the week here, and we'll enjoy checking that out from you and talking to you again right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box, very soon as well.
All right, Brandon, I'll see you in the new cozy confines tomorrow for Hedges.
That's exactly right. Looking forward to that.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so as you heard Jeff say, the new cozy confines, we are in the process of working on a brand new studio here, and some of it's kind of fully operational. There's other parts of it we're kind of building out over the course of time. You're going to notice not too much different right now, but eventually you may notice a good bit more as we kind of move on in the months ahead. So, enjoy checking that out. Looking forward to some pretty good stuff coming up on that. All right, let's do our SEC Through, and as we get ready to do that, I want to remind you about one thing here for a moment. Our friends at the UGA Alumni Association, we talk about a really cool stat. Here's a really cool stat. 96% of UGA undergraduate students are employed or pursuing advanced degrees within 6 months of graduation. That's amazing, right? And it's one of those things that Georgia grads and people who care about the University of Georgia are incredibly impressed by. It's part of what makes the UGA education so impactful. It's those opportunities that students have beyond the classroom to get that done, including the University of Georgia's Experiential Learning Initiative, which gives students hands-on opportunities to connect with their academic foundations, creative endeavors, study abroad, go into internship opportunities, so many more things like that. It's the opportunities that your gifts and donations to the university provide. It's that opportunity that helps these folks go through school, graduate, and then move on to great lives after that. So I hope you will keep that in mind when you make your gifts to UGA. And by the way, if you're a UGA alumnus or alumna and you want to show your pride in UGA, let me give you a website to also go to. It's give.uga.edu. The website, once again, give.uga.edu. Because when you donate to UGA, you're directly supporting the opportunities for students who are going out making the world a better place, building the facilities that make the university such an impressive place for us to tour and visit and see what the next generation of UGA grads are going to be able to do. By the way, speaking of the next generation of college athlete could very well have a array of choices that previous college athletes have not had much of a chance to enjoy. We are living in certainly interesting times. California, with the support of Los Angeles Lakers superstar LeBron James, has passed some legislation that's going to give student athletes in that state more freedom about how to use their likeness and more freedom about how to profit off of their own athletic abilities in kind of an endorsement vein, the same way that we would think of professional athletes being able to do this. Now, this has been met with a lot of controversy, especially from the NCAA. Now, there is an element of this kind of thing that no one relinquishes power voluntarily, and the NCAA sees as more student athletes get a chance to have control of their money and control of how their likeness is used to be traded for money. all of a sudden that reduces the power of the NCAA and some of the conferences within there. So there's been a lot of talk about that. I saw where SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey gave a statement to Sports Illustrated. Now, I'm not going to read the entire thing because this is kind of a maddening statement trying to make sense of, but a couple of sentences here. Meaningful concern, he says, related to inherent consequences that will inevitably arise when individual states unilaterally alter a set of rules that currently apply to student athletes and universities throughout the country. So what he's saying is that as more states kind of pass their legislation, I guess there's a chance that Florida could pass legislation, for instance, within the SEC footprint that could take effect by 2020, that each of these states, I know Utah's thinking about doing this, and each of these states going to having their own law. It says it's going to make it, what Sankey says is, it's going to make it more difficult for the NCAA to be able to operate because different states are going to have different laws. To me, this just sort of seems like an excuse for governing bodies that just don't want to deal with this new reality. Now, you don't have to be in favor of the new reality, but I think we would all agree that whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or not, certainly the NCAA and the conferences and all the people who are going to speak up on this for now within the world of college athletics, they like the old model because of how rich it made all of them. However, someone from outside at least the boundaries of the current world of college sports who's also spoken up on this is a former Georgia great and still one of the true icons in the state of Georgia, Herschel Walker. Walker gave a pretty pointed statement about the California legislation on Twitter yesterday. I want to share this with you. What Walker says is, I disagree with the governor of California signing the bill that allows scholarship NCAA athletes to get paid. There's a reason it's called amateur sports, Walker says. The school is paying for your degree. I do believe all scholarship athletes should receive a monthly fee, he says. So Walker's not in favor of this new potential world where athletes would have control over their likeness and their endorsements. Think about Todd Gurley signing autographs, which once led to an NCAA suspension. Now a guy like that would be free to do that kind of thing and keep the money that he makes for himself. I guess my overall takeaway is this. No one loves college sports more than I do. You may love it as much as I do, but you don't love it more than I do. And nobody would be more fearful of something that might put the future of college sports in jeopardy, college football included. It's not just my livelihood as a career. It's my ultimate passion as a weekend endeavor. I just love college football. I don't believe that anything that I've read thus far about the California legislation or anything like that, I don't believe that it puts football at risk, nor do I believe it violates any kind of standard of amateurism, things like that, because for the most part, I don't think really there are that many people that argue that anymore. Walker does, and as much as I love and respect Walker as a football player, on this particular issue, I think he's wrong. I think an education alone is a poor trade for the value that the top college football athletes, or really athletes in any sport, the value that the top athletes can potentially provide. I think an education alone is a poor trade for that value. So on this, and it's not the kind of thing I say very much, I'm on the opposite side of Herschel Walker. Now, reasonable people can disagree on this, but I feel pretty confident that the step towards giving these athletes a chance to market themselves and make money on that is probably a step in the right direction. And ultimately, after a couple of years, I believe we'll look back on this and say, well, I guess it kind of turned out not to be that big of a deal. Because here's the thing. There are only about, and I know this may sound wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. There are only about 5 or 10% of college football players who have any chance to market themselves anyway. There's just not an endless supply of autograph shows to go to. And there's just not an endless supply of auto dealers who are willing to pay X number of dollars to athlete to come over here and do a personal appearance here. For a guy like Jake Fromm, Tua Tagovailoa, Trevor Lawrence, DeAndre Swift, you can mention a few of these, there would be potentially a long list of marketing opportunities for them, and they may choose to take advantage of some of that kind of stuff. And I guess in my world, they probably should. It just seems fair and free and everything else. But for the most part, beyond the most well-known names in college football, a list that's probably not much more than 10, 15 names, beyond that, the opportunities for most of these guys are just going to be pretty limited. It's just not an endless supply of business opportunities out there. So if these kinds of laws get enacted by most states, there's only going to be in any given year a small number of football players who have enough fame and renown to even be able to take advantage of it. At least that's my thought on that. Let me do one more quick SEC thing before we move on there as well. You know, I hope you've checked out, we do a cover 4 at DawgNation.com where myself, our buddy Connor Riley, Jeff SENTELL, Mike Griffith, we all kind of weigh in on hot topics involving UGA or the teams around college football. We were asked, and this will be coming out at the website coming up in a couple days, not to give away the store before you get a chance to read it. We were asked to name the top 4 teams in college football right now. My top 4 as it stands right now are all 4 out of the SEC. I've got Georgia, I've got Alabama, I've got LSU, and I've got Auburn. Now, obviously, there won't be 4 teams in the SEC make the college football playoff, but the fact that this deep in the season, it's even debatable that the 4 best might be from this league, I do think that increases the likelihood that the SEC might get more than one team into the playoff this year. I think that, to me, is the early story of college football, that through a little more of, or right about a month of action thus far, I don't think that anyone can match the resume that the 4 SEC teams can right now. And that includes Oklahoma and Ohio State and Clemson and some of these other teams that get a lot of discussion. I'd be curious to hear how you feel about that. You can weigh in on this in our comment section. If you're watching on video, you can hit me up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. And for now, we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box today, I do want to get our topic back to the Georgia Bulldogs in full here in the game coming up this Saturday against the Tennessee Vols. And there are always going to be a lot of potential subplots when Georgia and Tennessee get together. These are rivals that have a long history against each other. But in the contemporary sense, what makes this week's game pretty interesting is the fact that it's Georgia for the first time doing battle with now former UGA offensive coordinator Jim Chaney. Now, this is a big deal for some UGA fans because they'd like to get a measure of retribution against him because they weren't always happy with his play calling when he was at Georgia and weren't happy with the way that Vols fans seemingly spiked the football when Chaney left Georgia for Tennessee in a really big contract. But as far as the impact on the field, Kirby Smart says that guys that do what I do for a living have a tendency to make a little too much of that. Here's Kirby on the subject of Chaney.
I think there's a lot more to it in you guys' stories than there is in real life. It's going to boil down to which guy blocks properly, which guy covers properly. There's no, secrets. I mean, we know what they do. They know what we do, but that's the case every week. That's what the tape's for. So there's a lot of familiarity there, and at the end of the day, the players got to go out and execute. They've got to play with a passion and energy, enthusiasm to beat the guy across from them and not make it about what our defensive coordinator calls or what their offensive coordinator calls. I just don't think that matters a whole lot. I think at the end of the day, it's blocking, tackling, turnovers, explosive plays, executing, and doing it with a lot of passion.
Yeah, I think for the most part, that's true from Smart. I think that we live in a world now where Georgia employs so many analysts and so many non-coaches within the football office that everybody's watching so much film on everybody, and teams like Georgia and Tennessee play each other so much during the season, or year over year, season after season. But there are very few secrets about what anybody does, and so Chaney leaving Georgia to go work at Tennessee, I'm not quite so sure he takes the military launch codes with him the way that some people might think that he does. I don't think there are that many secrets overall when it comes to college football. I do think that Smart's probably right in that. That's an example of coach speak that I probably believe, that we have a tendency to make a little too much of what Chaney might know about Georgia. I think for the most part, coaches kind of all know each other's tendencies and secrets. However, I thought that David Ubben from The Athletic had a pretty interesting line about just how ineffective Chaney has been in getting anything out of Jerry Garantano this year. That I thought was pretty interesting. By the way, Gator Hater update as we get ready to sign off. 1,067 days. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Box. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down as we roll through your comments and anything you want to talk about from today. We'll give you a chance to do that. The upcoming game against the Vols, what Jeff had to say about recruiting, you can kind of cover all that with us. And, of course, our friends at R.S. Andrews make it possible. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. It is all there for you at rsandrews.com. They're the ones that we trust to play every position, and we know that they can play all those positions well for you. All that stuff that's kind of behind the walls in your house that you can't see, R.S. Andrews makes that their life's work. They're experts at that. And story after story, they've been delivering smiles, and they can deliver a smile for you as well. But you got to check them out online at rsandrews.com. We'll hear from our buddy Connor Riley here in just a little bit, and we will hear from you as well. I did some Facebook comments a little earlier when we had a little bit of a lull in the action. So let me start on YouTube here for a moment, and we will do some comments there and give you all a chance to respond. Over here on the YouTube side of things for a moment, let's see. Spencer Edwards says the Ohio State offense is ridiculous. Even if Nebraska isn't good, they still whoop their butts. listen, right now the Buckeyes offense is really humming, and Fields gets a lot of credit for that. That's a fun offense to watch. Ryan Day is a really good offensive-minded coach, and thus far they've done some great things with Fields. Can't deny that. Green Soldier, a buddy, checks in to say UGA is one of 2 teams that has not allowed a rushing touchdown. That's a good stat, Green. That's a really good stat. How many games will UGA limit their opponents to 0 rushing touchdowns? You think they'd have a chance to do it this Saturday for sure. With all due respect to TV and Tevi and Feaster, South Carolina not great running the football either. That's a pretty interesting stat. I'm glad you shared that. Green Soldier, good stuff. Christy says Iowa's the other. That's pretty interesting. Caleb Waddle says that Ohio State will crumble under an actual defense. So I don't know about crumble. I mean, I do think there's going to be a major step up in weight class for Ohio State eventually. They have played, very, very little in the way of a impressive opponent, although I probably give them more credit for going into a hostile stadium like Lincoln, Nebraska was on Saturday than some of y'all do. So I'm going to give them a little bit of credit for the Nebraska game. But other than that, it's not exactly been the most dominant schedule for Ohio State at this point in time. That's certainly fair to say. Elite GB says Green needs some love, stand-up guy. Yeah, listen, Green Soldier's one of our favorites for sure. Alex MLD says Clemson, Alabama are down. We have the best team we've had. We have to take advantage and stomp our way to the national championship. Yeah, Alex, if you're the kind of fan that wanted some evidence through 5 weeks of college football that Alabama was beatable and that Clemson was beatable, both those teams have provided that. Now, they're not easy to beat. I don't think anyone in our comment section would say that they are. But if you were hoping for some evidence they could be beaten, they've both done that for you. Clemson, for whatever reason, and this is very inexplicable, they're just not what they were offensively right now compared to where they were a year ago. And in a lot of cases, we're talking same names. It's obviously still Lawrence at quarterback. It's obviously still Etienne at running back. It's T. Higgins and it's Justin Ross, the wide receiver position. Now, I'm not obsessing over Clemson football the way that I am over UGA football. So there could be a reason that Clemson fans kind of know about for why the offense has kind of struggled a little bit. But from my kind of 10,000-foot view over all of this, it is hard to understand why they are not marching up and down the field now the way they were last year. That's pretty odd right now. And then Alabama, much to the same degree, has kind of shown some blemishes too. Have not always run the ball particularly effectively, have not really shown much of a commitment to running the football. And then defensively, they had some issues against Ole Miss this past Saturday, including giving up some running plays that we're not quite used to seeing a team like Alabama give up to a team like Ole Miss. Now, I feel the need to repeat myself that the stuff that I just mentioned doesn't make Clemson and Alabama easily beatable, and it stands to reason by the time December rolls around, both these teams will be better in those regards than they are right now. But for the moment, they do look a little bit beatable. Now, you could probably come around and say, well, Georgia hasn't exactly, lit the world on fire against Power 5 competition offensively. There's that. You can point to the occasional blemish for Georgia here a little bit too. But for the 2 teams that pretty much everybody in America, I'm talking about national media and everything else, that consistently rated above Georgia, Clemson, and Alabama, neither of those teams have looked perfect thus far. Neither of those teams have looked perfect. What else is going on here on YouTube? Jeremy Shipe says that Clemson's being monitored for PEDs weekly. Obviously, I'll call back to the Osterine issue that they dealt with before the college football playoff last year. G. Gray says, I don't have anything to brag about. My team is suspect, vulnerable on defense. Our offense is on point. So, yeah, G's always been a pretty level-headed Alabama fan. I think he's sandbagging a little bit. I think he's probably a little bit more confident in his team than he's acting like right there. Because I don't think anyone's going to be shedding tears over any of the issues that Alabama's shown thus far. But as he said, the one thing you can't deny, the Alabama offense thus far has really been on point. As I said before, I think the goal is to be so explosive on offense that you can't hide it against anybody. And for the most part, Alabama can't hide that explosive offense against anybody. Something else I was going to say to Jeff when he was on with us a minute ago is, if you go back and watch some of the highlights, because I didn't see the entirety of the game against Ole Miss, I just saw the highlights. That was kind of interesting how many of the Devontae Smith routes that he was having success with this past Saturday, they did look a little bit to my eye like some of the stuff that we saw Dominic Blaylock do, especially that one 5-yard out where he caught against Arkansas State and then took it the distance. I think you can do kind of a side-by-side thing. Now, I don't know how Blaylock's going to compare over the course of a career as a receiver to Devontae Smith. But in terms of some of the ways that Alabama used Smith on Saturday, to my eye anyway, it looked a little similar to what we saw in the terms of the way that Georgia used Blaylock going back to the Arkansas State game a couple of weeks ago. Will says Tennessee isn't getting more than 10 unless we bust a coverage. You may be right about that. I certainly would love to see Georgia keep up that stingy defense. It's been pretty impressive to see thus far. Over here on Facebook, Jeremy Chapman says Fromm passes for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns on Saturday. He asks that as a question. I'd love to see it, Jeremy. I would. I think that's certainly a possibility. At one point in time, I would have told you that this Tennessee secondary might be a formidable test for Georgia. Maybe that seems a little less so now. They've had some uncertain statuses within that group. So pretty interesting. Bill Coon says, I will be in Rocky Top. Remember, don't underestimate a dog backed into a corner, fighting for his life like Smokey is going to be doing. Game Saturday will be much closer than people expect for the first 3 quarters at least. So that's an interesting take from a pretty big Georgia fan there. Pretty interesting. Jeremy Lloyd says, "B.A., do you know what's up with Roquan Smith right now?" I don't. He didn't play for the Bears on Sunday, I believe, but I don't really know kind of what's going on there with that. I'm not sure about that. We'll have to look into that just a little bit. Lonnie Floyd says that the governor of California or whoever it was that passed the law for athletes to get paid for autographs, I thought that was an NCAA rule. Well, in this case, a law would supersede a rule. The NCAA would be forced to operate under the state laws of whatever state it's going to be in. But also, I believe, and I think the law would back me up on this, the NCAA has the legal right to exclude anyone it wants to from participating in its competitions. So the California law, would say, hey, if you want to operate here, you have to let these folks, you have to allow these people to respect their, right on this. And the NCAA could say, well, we're just not going to do that. So, they would have a right to be exclusionary if they want to, but the California folks are going to say, if our people do this, they're going to have to, have a chance to, enjoy this freedom. Moss YL, wow, y'all don't miss anything. Moss YL says, I know I didn't explain that last thing particularly well. I apologize for that. I guess I'm not a lawyer after all. Moss YL says, BA, where's your wedding ring? So I don't wear a wedding ring. I wear a watch, but I don't wear a wedding ring. My wife, we've been married now since 2002. What is this, 2019? So we've been married going on 17 years, something along those lines. Within our first year of marriage, I finally got a pass not to wear my ring anymore because I always take it off. I have a lot of nervous energy. Y'all notice that during the show. I'm scribbling stuff down on paper. I'm playing with the Deemer box. I'm playing with Eddie. I just have a lot of nervous energy. I just kind of bounce around. A lot of people when they do TV they just kind of sit still like that. I don't have that kind of capability. I can't sit real still. I'm always kind of moving. And if you give me a ring, I'm just taking it on, taking it off. I'll do the thing where you kind of spin it like a quarter, and I kept losing it. My wife didn't want to lose it. She wanted to at least keep it as an heirloom, if nothing else. So she told me I didn't have to wear it anymore. So I've never worn a ring. I've pretty much always worn a watch. I like wearing watches on my wrist. The ring was just always just real hard for me to get used to. So we end up not doing that. Clarence Dawson says a lot of talk about date nights. My wife and I had a date night last night. I had a nice little date. So that was good times. Good times. Gregory Nowak says closeness of the Tennessee game could be determined on quarterback play. Vols have offensive skill talent, but Garantano has been awful so far this year. Yeah, he has been. I, for the most part, blame that on a Tennessee offensive line that's not been great, but as I didn't really quite have time to read all these stats, but as David Ubben points out, that I'll read this to you. He says, on passes when he's under pressure, Garantano's throws have been on target on just 61% of pass attempts, down from 73% a year ago. In 2018, he was first nationally in percentage of on-target pass under pressure. This year's 38. On throws that traveled at least 15 air yards, Garantano was on target 67.2% of his attempts, good for 11th nationally. This year, he's just 54.5%, lower than 68 passers with at least 20 attempts longer than 15 yards this year. So, I mean, that's a lot of words, but what Ubben from who covers the Vols is essentially saying there is that in a lot of ways in which Garantano impressed a year ago, he's been worse than that this year. So, somehow, some way, he's just not the quarterback he was last season. Whether you blame that on the struggles of the Tennessee offensive line, they weren't that great a year ago. I'm not quite sure what you do with that. Grant Bass says he doesn't wear a wedding ring either after 23 years. Yeah. I mean, listen, I look more married than probably anybody in the world does, so I guess I probably can get away with that. But yeah, I've never really worn the wedding ring. Kathy Aquavia Green asked about the spinning helmet. Yeah, we'll have our hover helmet back here on the set again pretty soon. I'm glad you noticed, Kathy. Appreciate that. Travis Baltziger says it's going to become an unwanted trend. States that follow suit will have negative recruiting used against them. I mean, I think for the most part, I really do believe that this will end up not being as big of a deal as it seems, because we kind of did the same thing with the full cost of education stipend, where different programs have different amounts. And for the most part, that's been around now for almost, 5 years now. And we don't even really talk about that anymore. So much so we've kind of forgotten, whose full cost of attendance was far larger than someone else's. I think this is going to be kind of the same thing, as I said before. There is just not an endless supply of people willing to give marketing deals to college athletes, because at some point in time, I don't care how benevolent a booster you are, everybody wants some sort of return on their investment. Take Jake Fromm, for instance. If this rule was intact, or this law was intact in Georgia right now, and Jake Fromm got to go do an autograph signing at pick whichever mall you want to in the state of Georgia, he'd have a line out the back door for hours and hours and hours. But it's not like he could come back the next week and have the same number of people there to get an autograph. I mean, at some point in time, everybody that wants a Jake Fromm autograph has gotten one, or wants a DeAndre Swift autograph has gotten one, or a Tua Tagovailoa autograph has gotten one. I mean, there are a few players that could really stand to make some money off their likeness. But in any given year, the total number of players who truly stand to benefit from this is not going to be as high as the average person assumes. And you say, well, what about the rogue booster who wants to, pay $200,000 to every single recruit? There are a lot of tax implications for doing that too much as well. It's not, it's not like you can just, free will, just add a bunch of employees to your, overall payroll there. There's some tax implications that go along with that too. And there's also not an endless supply of people in the world who are willing to just kind of throw that kind of money out over and over and over again as well. It looks like Connor Riley's ready to join us. I'm not hearing you. We'll see if we can get Connor's microphone taken care of. I told you before, we're kind of changing our studio, so some things are going to take a little while to get used to. Some things are going to take a little while to kind of get fixed up and running. I'm hearing something, just not hearing Connor. So he'll get that squared away, and he will be with us here in just a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you beautifully now.
There we go.
All right, Connor, what were you wanting to say?
Let's talk about real football and not talk about economics and the downfall of college.
Talk about whatever you want.
Just anything but that.
You can talk about whatever you want.
I do have a question for you.
Okay.
What have you seen out of Alabama that is more impressive than what you've seen out of Ohio State?
I would argue that Alabama's win over Duke is measurably more impressive than anything Ohio State, Oklahoma, or Clemson has done this year. Duke is 38th in FPI. They're 3-1 on the season. I think that you would have a hard time finding a win. If we're gonna really get granular on this, I think you'd have a hard time finding a resume win for Ohio State that matches Alabama's win against Duke.
I think Cincinnati's a pretty good football team and might actually be able to beat Duke going head to head if those two teams met. Cincinnati was a team that won 11 games last year. They've pretty handily won all the other games they've played. They've got a big contest against UCF at home this week. Based on what we've seen, sure, Ohio State, quote-unquote, hasn't played anybody, but I don't think, Alabama has really, quote-unquote, played anybody either, and I think it's pretty clear that Ohio State has looked more dominant in all of its games, even if there is, you want to nitpick about schedule and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the one thing I'm not going to tell you is that Ohio State hasn't looked impressive. They certainly have looked impressive. Cincinnati is 29th, by the way, in FPI right now, so certainly they get some credit for that. In a neutral field against David Cutcliffe, do I take the Blue Devils there? Maybe I do. That's not a huge degree of difference in the FPI ranking. Certainly Ohio State has looked impressive on this. But I do think the fans who want to say, hey, before we get too out in front of ourselves on giving Justin too much credit, giving Ohio State too much credit, let's see what they look like against some of the other Big Ten teams they're going to play. Because I'm not one of these guys that bangs on the entirety of the Big Ten. There are plenty of good games that Ohio State will play this season. I do believe they play Wisconsin out of the West in the regular season. Obviously, the Big Ten East is a pretty tough division. So Iowa State's got some testing games coming up. I just don't think they've played them as of yet.
Right, and I would say their schedule going forward is more difficult than what Alabama has to face because other than LSU and Auburn, I'm not really sure there's a team on their schedule that can really test them. Whereas I know Michigan is down, but Michigan is still probably better than the third best team left on Alabama's schedule. You still have an unbeaten Penn State team. You have an unbeaten Wisconsin team as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it comes down to, do you think the pair of Wisconsin and Penn State? And I thought the Penn State was pretty impressive on Friday to go into Maryland and dominate that game the way they did. You can say what you want about Maryland, but Penn State from the word go dominated that game. I'll give Penn State some credit for that. I thought Wisconsin, the way they handled, Michigan, for instance. You say what you want about Michigan, that's still a thorough beatdown from the word go. Wisconsin is pretty good, but I don't believe that the pair of Wisconsin-Penn State is more challenging than the pair of LSU-Auburn.
I don't know. I mean, we'll find out a lot about Auburn this coming month, with games against Florida and LSU. I mean, there's a chance they lose both those games, and at the end of this month, we're talking about this Auburn team very differently than we are this Wisconsin or Penn State team.
Certainly. I mean, the one thing that I feel the strongest about through 5 weeks, 4 games for Georgia, is the team right now in the country that has the least to apologize for anything is Auburn. When you beat Oregon in a neutral site situation, when you beat Texas A&M on the road, that's still a pretty tough road environment. When you dominate Mississippi State, as bad as I think the Bulldogs are, that's a team that got some preseason top 25 votes. Of all the teams in college football right now, the team that has the least to apologize for and the team that is proven, I think, unquestionably the most this season is Auburn. I believe if I had a poll vote right now, I might give them the number 1 vote.
No,
you
wouldn't.
I don't believe they're the best team in the country. I don't believe they're the best team in the country, but I said this the other day when you weren't here. Barry Trammell, the Oklahoma columnist, goes on the Feinbaum show and made a big deal about how he only ranks his top 10 rankings on the basis of what has happened thus far. Philosophically, I kind of agree with that. Philosophically, I kind of agree with only going by what someone has done this far. And I don't think anyone can match what Auburn's done to this point in time. And they're going to lose. I think they're going to lose to Georgia. I think they probably lose to Alabama. But up to this point in time, I don't think anyone can match that resume.
I think LSU's win over Texas is better than what. And I'm a Pac-12 I'm a well-known Pac-12 apologist. I almost wore my Oregon sweater today. I think LSU's win over Texas is more impressive than what Auburn has on its resume to this point going into Austin. I'd maybe make an argument that the Notre Dame win, maybe not right now, but over the course of the season as they continue to pick up wins, because I think they're going to beat USC and I think they're going to beat Michigan, and there's a real chance they finish 11-1. I think there's a chance Georgia could have a better resume than Auburn does to this point, because while we bring up the Mississippi State game, they also only beat Tulane 24-6. So, if we want to really get in there and nitpick, which I don't, but I mean, Auburn is in my top 4 for anyone saying, "Oh, you're just a hater." No, they're in my top 4. They're probably my number 3 team right now. I would have LSU 1, Georgia 2, Auburn 3, Ohio State 4.
I mean, my biggest argument with the human polls as they are, and I do think the playoff rankings get this a little bit more right, but this is mostly just for theater and for show. I think that if you really want to do accurate rankings, your rankings should be wildly different week to week. And, I mean, there's a chance that, we don't really do, you and I, weekly top 4s, things like that. But if we really did, and if we really took them seriously, we would be, I think, wildly different week to week. Whereas, especially in the beginning of the season where you have a relatively limited sample size of information available to you, where if you only base it on what you've seen thus far, I might give the love to the 4 SEC teams, which I did in the cover 4 that you'll read this week at DawgNation.com. But after this upcoming week, we're going to add like 15% more data into our ability to consume college football. We're going to know 15% more after this upcoming Saturday than we have up to this point in time. There's a chance that extra 15% might require me to take 2 of my teams out and put 2 more teams in, or it might cause me to take 3 of them out and put 3 more of them in.
So I have a question.
Please.
Let's say Florida beats Auburn handily.
Mm-hmm.
Or not handily, it's a convincing, no doubt about it win. Do you put Florida in your top 4?
At that point in time, I'd have to really think about it. I mean, if I'm going to give teams credit for wins, then you got to give credit for the Auburn win. I'd have to look at what that would do. I mean, there aren't that many teams in the country right now. It's Georgia, it's I mean, who has a win as good as Florida if it were to beat Auburn on Saturday? LSU would. They've beaten Texas. It's just LSU, Georgia.
That's probably it. I mean maybe you want to say
Auburn
Wisconsin.
Auburn right now does not have a win as good as what Florida would have if it beat Auburn this upcoming Saturday.
I mean, Oregon beating Oregon on a neutral field, I think might be as impressive as beating Auburn at home, if that makes sense. Because that game was real close. You know, Oregon had a lead with, I believe, 15 seconds left, and Auburn scored a go-ahead touchdown. So those teams are pretty even, and, you know, you do have the built-in sort of home field advantage there in Gainesville. So, you know, maybe if you wanted to make an argument that Auburn win is as impressive, but yeah, it obviously depends on how Florida will come out and play in that game. And, you know, I believe if Ohio State or Alabama's off this week, but, you know, if Ohio State comes out and rolls again against Michigan State, you know, that's another impressive, that's another top 25 win. I believe that'd be their first top 25 win.
How about the point that I made earlier in the show, though, that when you look at Georgia in comparison to some of these other teams, the one thing that does not get enough credit right now is how stingy the Georgia defense has been. I think that we talk a lot about havoc, and we should. And typically I'm the last one to bring up any kind of like points allowed stat because it typically is more of a function of who you've played more so than how you have played. However, in Georgia's case, I'm not quite so sure that who it's played isn't a pretty good argument for the fact that it's only given up 10 points per game. The Arkansas State offense is truly explosive. Notre Dame's a top 10 team. Vanderbilt scored nearly 40 against LSU. The fact that against that schedule, Georgia's only allowed 10 points a game, I think that's got to factor into our comparison of Georgia with Auburn, with LSU, with certainly Alabama, Clemson, those teams that we typically compare Georgia to. The stinginess of Georgia's defense, I actually think probably deserves a little more discussion than it's gotten up to this point.
It does, but here's the thing with college football, and really you could equate this to all football in general. People like points. They want to see points. Yeah. They give more value to putting up points. Everyone is talking, and I wrote about Justin Fields and Jake Fromm today and why, you know, the stats-based argument to say that Fields is better than Fromm, you know, aren't really fair to Fromm because his game has never been about statistics. And I have no doubt that if he played in Ryan Day's offense, he would put up numbers that were similar to Dwayne Haskins a year ago. But, you know, everyone's praising Fields for the performance that he had on Saturday, another 4 touchdowns and whatnot. But to me, watching that game, or at least the first half before I checked out and put on Shawshank Redemption because it was an awful Saturday night slate, that Ohio State defense was better, in my estimation, than what the Ohio State offense was doing. But because, you know, people like exciting football, they, you know, like points. That's why I think more people would say they'd rather watch a Big 12 game than a Big 10 game. You know, the defensive discussion sort of gets lost and weighted down, and people always, you know, like to pick nits and pick flaws with your offense. And, you know, if you want to even look at a more micro example of that, you look at the 2 Alabama losses, that Georgia has had a lot of people wonder about, you know, the offense has sort of disappeared in the fourth quarter, and it has, but the defense and special teams in those second halves of those games has struggled as well, and for whatever reason, there doesn't seem to be that same sort of level of criticism about that unit.
So I think it's important to remember, though, that this is one area in which college football is still pretty different than the NFL, because I do my Falcons show, and I make Falcons fans mad sometimes. I don't mean to do this, but defense has never mattered less in the NFL than it does right now. Running the football has never mattered less in the NFL than it does right now. We've seen some legitimately bad defenses in the last decade win Super Bowls. In college football, for the most part, the national champions still have elite defense. Now, they have explosive offenses, too. College, because of the way that you acquire talent, you're going to have dominance on both sides of the ball typically. But it's not as easy for a mediocre to bad defense in college to win as it is in the NFL, where that really has become a, you know, play in space type of offensive situation. So I think while fans are attracted to offense, and I'm as attracted to the offensive side of the ball as anyone is, I think when you look at what really works in terms of the college football playoff, being able to do what Georgia does and limit some of these big offenses, I think that may actually matter. So I agree with you, Connor, that it might not get a lot of fan and media attention heading into the big game, but if Georgia maintains for the entirety of a season the stinginess that it's shown through 4 games, and I think that's a pretty big factor in determining who's actually going to win some of these games when they're played.
To push back on the NFL bit a little bit, last year the Super Bowl was 13-3 and won by the team that had the better defense.
There are low-scoring games, but you can look at this. People who care about Football Outsiders, DVOA, and stuff like that, we've seen defenses ranked like 25 and below win Super Bowls. I mean, we don't see, and that's out of a 32-team league, we don't see non-top 10 defenses win national championships very much.
I mean, yeah, but that probably also equates maybe to the talent disparity, whereas, the NFL, it is obviously more spread out with the salary cap and the draft and things like that, whereas the teams at the top are obviously able to equate more talent. But, shifting this back to the Georgia defense, yes, they've played good and played well to this point, but I do sort of wonder, in the game that I've sort of have circled, is that Auburn game, because, Georgia's run defense hasn't really been tested so far. I don't think Notre Dame is a great rushing team. I don't think Florida's going to be a good rushing team. I don't think any team they're going to see in the month of October is a good rushing team. Missouri might give you some pause. I still want to see a little bit more out of them. But, the Auburn's right now, I believe, the number one rushing team in the SEC. And, if that's going to be the type of game that I think it's going to be, whoever wins that line of scrimmage, because I think Georgia's offensive line and Auburn's defensive line are essentially a wash. And I actually think to this point in the year, Auburn's offensive line and Georgia's defensive line have sort of played above what maybe we thought they were capable of going into the season. And if they, whoever can come out on top in that sort of aspect, I think is going to have a really good shot at actually winning that game.
Let me get a few comments here because we've been talking now for a while. Steve Schiavini says Oregon and Michigan were top 10, then got knocked out if that counts. Just saying. Somebody also mentioned before that Georgia is the only team to earn a win this season against the current top 10. By the way, Matt Rukavina, world traveler, going through the airport again today. Man, he really travels, man. He's always somewhere. John Arena, not happy with Jim Coley's play calling thus far. Robert Barnes says, I hope we work out our punting problems. It's kind of funny. Georgia is going to be a very big favorite the next 3 weeks. There is a chance that we don't know much about Jake Camarda's improvement or lack thereof over the course of the next 3 weeks, because there's a chance that Georgia's not punting very much. You could find out some good news about Camarda, but that potentially leads to another series of problems if somehow if Georgia's having to punt very much against the 3 teams about to play here coming up. It's just going to be a weird month of October where after the big build-up of the Notre Dame game, Georgia finds itself facing 3 opponents that, while certainly you want to see Georgia improve and get better in terms of truly learning a whole lot about UGA, including whatever might be happening with Camarda, you may not get a lot of proof about that one way or another against the 3 opponents that you're about to play.
With the 3 opponents Georgia's about to play at the end of the month, over under Georgia's combined margin of victory in those 3 games, 90 points.
Over under, you're saying?
Yes.
If it's under 90, I hate to say this. Gosh, I said this yesterday. You weren't here. I feel like I shot my mouth off a little too much for the Notre Dame game, so I'm trying to be a little more humble. Because yesterday,
humble yourself. Humble yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Davin. Yesterday, I had the people in the comment section egging me on about calling for another shutout for 2 consecutive years in Neyland Stadium. I'm trying to be a little more humble, so I'm going to say under. I'm going to say under. I'm going to say
take the over. Life's too short to bet the under. And I will just add, because I was pretty emphatic with how I thought that Notre Dame game was going to play out. If Tyler Simmons doesn't muff a punt, and I know ifs and nuts and all that gibberish, if Tyler Simmons doesn't muff a punt and Kirby goes for it on 4th down, that's a 17-point win.
Yeah.
I believe that would cover the spread.
Very different feeling.
Depending on where you got that number.
Yeah. Very different feeling.
And, my estimation from watching that game, especially the second half, was Georgia really controlled the tempo and flow of the pace of that game. Other than a drive in the first quarter, I think Georgia, I don't know if that the actual final score necessarily indicates how much better I think Georgia is than Notre Dame.
Yeah, I think, and you hear the committee sometimes talk about game control. I don't 100% understand what they mean by that. I'm not even sure they do. I've always felt like that was kind of a made-up stat. But it's kind of ironic. Georgia, for the most part, had game control for most of the second half until the very end. Like once Notre Dame's got the ball driving to potentially win, your game control probably wasn't too great at that point in time. But most of your second half, you had pretty strong game control against the Irons.
Right, and if that whole 4th down, I really think did sort of swing the momentum, because it did keep Notre Dame within 2 scores, and there was enough time left, obviously, for them to sort of feel, hey, we can still make a game out of this. Whereas if they go down and get a touchdown and it's a 3-score game, or even if earlier in the game, if Tyler Simmons is able to haul in that perfectly placed pass from Jake Fromm earlier on in the game, I think it's a very different feeling type of game.
Will says that Kentucky and South Carolina are not winning in Athens. We'd obviously agree with that. Let me take this a different route. Between the October opponents, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Kentucky, I am firmly in the belief that South Carolina is way better than all 3 of those. We all think that, right?
South Carolina, I don't know how I would define way better, but South Carolina is the best team Georgia will see this month.
Yeah, I mean, a quarterback that I have real legitimate respect for, and we've been round and round about Garantano. I'm always going to have to leave that one by the side of the road. But as David Ubben pointed out, maybe you blame Chaney for that. So yeah, I mean, I think that South Carolina at least throws it around enough that you got to be a little bit respectful of that. And Edwards as a receiver is pretty good. I honestly don't know. What kind of year is Feaster having? Is he having a good year? Probably not great.
Not that I can recall.
Yeah, I don't know his stats. That's historically been South Carolina's problem in recent years. Eric S. says Auburn has a better defense with less recruiting. Explain. Well, they've really hit, though, on recruits in one key area. I mean, you look at the overall composite and say they haven't recruited as well as Georgia, but Georgia wanted Big Cat Bryant. Auburn got him. Georgia wanted Derek Brown. Auburn got him. I mean, that's guys in that defensive line. That's that front seven. Now, the Auburn secondary has actually played pretty well this year, too. But while you may say, well, the Auburn as a whole hasn't recruited as well as Georgia has, you can point to head-to-head wins that are still on that Auburn roster that make up a big difference. Now, I don't know that Connor or either one are saying the Auburn defense is better than Georgia's, but in terms of being a really tough defense for Georgia to match up with, or really a tough defense for anybody to match up with, it's the head-to-head wins they've gotten over Georgia in recruiting that make that potentially true, I believe.
Yeah, and to Georgia's credit, as much as I talk up the Auburn defensive line as people do, Georgia's offensive line had their way with that Auburn defensive line a year ago. I believe DeAndre Swift ran for 186 yards, and most of that was because he got untouched and got into that sort of second and third level. So, I think Auburn is going to want to prove that they're not that team that Georgia pretty physically roughed up last year, because Auburn couldn't run the ball against Georgia all that well a season ago. I pretty vividly remember early on in that game they had a 3rd and 2 and they were chucking the ball with Jarrett Stidham. I'm like, that this is not how Auburn is going to win this game. So, and you saw a week ago against the Mississippi State team that ran all over them a year ago. Cole Kubiak brought this point up. He said he felt like that game was personal to Auburn, and that meant a lot, and I wonder if that Georgia game maybe has the same sort of feel.
Plus, I mean, Georgia, by almost anyone's estimation, tried to run up the score on Auburn last year. Tried to fake.
They did.
Yeah. I mean, some have said that Georgia tried to run up the score against Auburn last year. My guess is that may get talked about, on that campus here a little bit before that game.
There is the whole, they did run up the score on them in recruiting by plucking George Pickens from them on literally the last hour. So, that Auburn game is going to mean a lot to Gus Malzahn and that sort of Auburn team, I think.
I heard a stat. I don't know if this is true. I don't have a reason to think that it's not. I just haven't verified this myself. Do you know that what somebody told me, that a 9-win Auburn team under Gus Malzahn has never lost to Nick Saban? 9 wins or better Auburn team.
Yeah, that makes sense because, so they've lost at LSU every time they've played them since 1999 in Baton Rouge. Usually when Georgia beats them, that's usually not a good sign that they're going to beat Alabama, because I do not believe, since Malzahn has been there, and really I think this entire decade, the 3 times that they've beaten Georgia, they have also gone on to beat Alabama as well. So, there's your sort of 3 losses right there, and you factor in an occasional blip against Texas A&M and Mississippi State. I can certainly see and understand that.
And I am firmly of the belief, I said this earlier, and some of y'all think I just spout off nonsense, but I believe that Auburn's current schedule arrangement helps it more than it hurts it. To get Georgia and Alabama in your own stadium every other November is actually a pretty nice coup, because you're not going to compete for championships more than every other year for the most part anyway, given where you stack up in recruiting right now. But to have those home games in November really, really matters. By the way, Ken Blankenship, our buddy, somebody asked before about Rodrigo as a punter. He said, go back and check out Rodrigo's senior season high school highlight film and see him get off a huge punt after the ball went sailing over his head. I'm sure that's probably pretty impressive to see. I'd actually like to see that. Winston Mock says, just believe in my gut that we are going to the Plains and leaving with a W fairly easily. Yeah, I think that we were saying this off the air yesterday, and we may do this on the air at some point in time. I hope that people appreciate that game for what it is. It's the kind of game where you don't need any style points whatsoever. Beating Auburn in Jordan-Hare Stadium is a big win no matter what. You just got to celebrate that and say, that's a good performance from Georgia. You can debate if Florida is that way or not, but if Georgia goes in and wins that game in Jordan-Hare Stadium, that's a big message, not only for how Georgia stacks up amongst the national elite this season, but for how much it's improved comparison to the 27 and 2018 teams that did not pass its big road test in those years. We all remember how bad Jordan-Hare was in the Dogs in 2017, and obviously Baton Rouge last season. If Georgia goes into Jordan-Hare, wins that game this year, I think you're seeing program growth under Kirby Smart, which doesn't guarantee win the national championship this year, but I think makes you more of a legitimate threat to do so, maybe even than the team that came within an eyelash of doing that in 2017 there as well. Gregory Noack also says that Auburn's Jekyll and Hyde every year. Boy, I know we talk about that kind of stuff a lot, but it really is true. All right, we're going to get ready to go. Travis Baltiger says thoughts on Auburn at LSU. I think the LSU passing game right now makes them very tough to beat. I have great respect for Auburn. I think that's a really, really tough opponent. But I just think LSU, the way they throw the football around, makes them really, really tough to beat. And if you've got LSU on your schedule, I think you should be nervous about that. Eventually, I believe they'll probably get better defensively. Right now, they're not. Eventually, I believe they do get better defensively. But, man, that Burrow passing game is for real at the moment. They don't run it great for whatever reason, and they're not playing the kind of defense we're typically used to seeing unless you do. But I believe that passing game makes them very, very tough. Connor, you got a final thought?
I do not, no.
Thank you. Let me say this as we get ready to go here. We got, of course, you want to check out the AJC for your Atlanta news now. Those of you who live in the Atlanta area, Braves playoff begin on Thursday. A couple relatively early evening starts on Thursday and Friday. You can get all your Braves playoff coverage there at AJC.com. Also, continuation of the series investigating some of the senior care facilities in the Atlanta area and kind of some of the stuff that maybe has gone on behind closed doors you might not have been aware about. A really deep, detailed investigation by the AJC. Really good work there on that. And believe it or not, it is fall, even though it's 1,000 degrees outside. I drove into my neighborhood yesterday afternoon. My pool, as I'm driving right down the right, is packed out. It might have been the 4th of July. I mean, they're just people just bathing suits, pool, weather, everything else. First question is, does nobody work? Second question is, how interesting is this that we live in a place where late September people are still rocking the swimming pool? So good stuff there on that. Is today October 1st, by the way? We are now on the first day of October. So good stuff there. But fall is going to be here, leaves turning, things like that. So go to AJC.com and find out about some really good fall getaways. And by the way, also a kind of a look ahead to a SunTrust Park as well, because that's going to be the host for the Braves, the playoffs coming up. Traffic always tricky, parking always tricky. Follow your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. You can stay up to date on all of that. And by the way, speaking of hot weather outside, that means air conditioning is going to be turned on and really cranked and cooling you down. And if yours is not working the way that it should, you need that $99 tune-up from my friends at R.S. Andrews. They will get your system back to factory fresh specs. But you got to reach out to them online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day, and I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Deemer Block. We'll talk to you then.